Welcome back. Dr. JC here, week 14-15, part 2. We're going to talk about British colonial America most specifically here. And rather than go into great detail about all the different aspects or regions associated with the settlement of British North America, those 13 colonies that will be the original 13 states after America's independency, I'm going to simply focus on some more salient features. Labor, for one, and then the differences between the geographic sections and how that may have the actual peopling or settlement of these different regions may have set America on a trajectory towards conflict. And I'll explain what we mean by that a little bit later in this lecture. So let's jump into British colonial America. Now, before we get into some specifics as it relates to various characteristics associated with English or British settlement, I want to remind everybody that just because the English did it a certain way doesn't mean that the Dutch, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the French, the Swedes, and other Europeans approached colonization the same way the English did, because they don't. The English will be very specific in the way they interact with native peoples, the way they approach colonization, especially here in the New World. And it's important to note that when we're talking about Britain's American colonies here, British American colonials were very proud and happy to be British. Keep that in mind. And the reason they're proud to be part of this British Empire is because Britain at the time was arguably among the most liberal or progressive of societies in the day. They operate under a Magna Carta. They have a constitutional monarchy, which means the king does not have unlimited power. That power really does reside in the Parliament, whether it's in its upper house, the House of Lords, or its lower house, the House of Commons. And so Britain's operated under more natural rights than most peoples on the globe. Therefore, American colonials that first came here, yes, they're going to begin to see themselves as Americans fairly quickly. And we'll talk about that once we get into these various characteristics of English settlement. But they're very proud to be British Americans, which makes this leap towards independency all the more interesting. So what are some of these different characteristics that make English settlement a little bit different perhaps than other European powers? Well, first and foremost, all English settlement, save perhaps the colony of Georgia, which we'll talk about briefly later, all these colonies were established as business enterprises. These were for-profit endeavors, okay? They're here to make money, period. Capitalism hit the shore here from the get-go. That's part of America's tradition and roots, a capitalist society. Another aspect as it relates to British settlement here is they approached it from a closed perspective, which means they didn't necessarily try to interact with others. They had a certain system that they were going to follow, and they were going to follow it to a T because theirs was the best. And if that sounds like there's a degree of hubris or cockiness there, yeah, the British had it. And why not? And in some sense, why not still to present day? You get it. The British pound is still the best currency out there, right? The problem with this closed approach, however, is you better darn well sure hope that what you have on paper is going to match then with the reality of the situation. And that's what's going to be part of the problem here, is that the British really thought in their mind, we can create a New York from the old world just like the old York. We can do a new Kent, just like we have an old Kent. That everything in the old world could be transplanted right here to the new world, and everything in Britain then, all British society, all British customs, all British social mores, you name that, they could easily be transplanted here in the Americas. And so that there was this huge disconnect between the folks back in England, back in London, hammering those folks out here in the New World saying, you know, what's the problem? Get it done. And the folks here that are leading these entrepreneurial endeavors in the New World are screaming back as best as they can, as respectfully as they can, saying, look, we ain't in Kansas anymore, Toto. This is a freaking different place. Y'all need to go ahead and leave your little freaking cubicle and bring your keister on this side of the Atlantic. I'll show you what we're talking about. I get what you guys want to do. We're not able to do it here, however, because this is just a different place. So almost immediately you start to see this Americanization of British colonials start to appear. And that Americanization will cover all 13 colonies. Now, when we'll see here in a few minutes, these 13 colonies are going to be different. They're going to create different sorts of cultures themselves, which is going to lead to a different fight down the road. Spoiler alert, keying up the American Civil War for you already, right? But they are going to see themselves as uniquely American, albeit still British. So you see the seeds in some ways of this American independency starting almost right from the get-go. In British colonial America, there are several different regions. We'll start here in the Chesapeake. And anytime we're talking about the Chesapeake, we're talking about Maryland and Virginia, all right? So you'll have the Chesapeake. We'll go next to the New England states. We will then go to these middle colonies, which is New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Penn's Colony or Pennsylvania. And then we'll move into these southern colonies, North and South Carolina and Georgia. Starting in the colonial Chesapeake, which is Maryland and Virginia, as mentioned, no gold and no silver was to be found. The Spanish and Portuguese are going to have a lot greater success with that in Incan and Aztec lands. So for proprietors here looking to try to make some coin, how are you going to do that? They find the answer in tobacco, and a tobacco economy will explode here in Maryland and Virginia. Yet for anyone who knows anything about agriculture, tobacco robs the soil of nitrogen, and therefore the soil will become depleted very quickly. And as a result of that, they are going to need to drive westward. And the further westward you drive, you're driving into native people's lands. So confrontation between white-skinned folks and red-skinned folks is going to become inevitable. And in some ways, this confrontation is inevitable because of the way they view land. Native peoples, even though they may not agree with one another or like one another, they all tend to view the land as something they hold communally in trust. They are custodians of the spirit that moves through all things, what Europeans might call God or nature's God. Europeans, however, view the land much differently. This is something they can own, not hold in communal trust. Therefore, Europeans are going to have no problem putting up fences, and as we do today, no hunting signs, right? Step on my land, I shoot your ass. Get off it. So very different mindsets between Europeans and native peoples, and that's going to lead to confrontation as well. So if you're entrepreneurs and you need laborers, probably not going to go fishing in that redskin pool for labor. Number one, they're starting to die off wholesale from disease, and number two, they flat out don't like you, bro. Ain't going to work there. So you better go look for labor somewhere else, perhaps in the white world. And white laborers will be used. They're called indentured servants. These are individuals that don't have the money or the economic means to pay for their transportation from the old world to the new world. Therefore, they will negotiate a contract with somebody to pay their way. Part of this contract is that you are going to sign your life away for X number of years to serve as an indentured servant to somebody. Once you've lived out the length of the contract, usually 5 years if you're a skilled laborer, 7 years if you don't have a skill. If you live beyond that 5 and 7 years, you're a free person and you can strike out on your own. So the question becomes, well, why would anyone in their right mind sign their life away for 5 to 7 years? Folks then, in some sense like today, sold their labor for means and a reason. Now, yes, there are patriotic Americans today, and we love them, myself included. And yes, I served the country, and I'm happy to have done so. But at the same token, it didn't hurt that I got the GI Bill and a college fund, right? There was a sweetener there. And the sweetener for folks back in the age was, hi, if you were from the old world and you were from a family name that was not recognized in society, you're not going anywhere. You're never going to move up in social rank. You can't. But if you come over here to this new world, you can quite literally make yourself, well, not quite literally, but figuratively, you can make yourself a king. You could own hundreds, even thousands of acres based on your own talent, your own merit, your own hard work, not based on a family name. And in some ways, that's how this new world was much new than the old world. That's how America was so much different than the old world. It didn't matter where you were born. And it didn't matter who your daddy was. It only mattered what you did. And if you worked hard, you created and innovated, you could rise in society. You could be a politician. You could be a business leader. And so individuals were more than willing to trade away a few years of their life to have that opportunity for themselves and their families. Just makes sense. And in thinking about everything I just said, there's the problem with white indentured servitude. At some point, that servitude ends. And you become what? A fellow competitor. Think about it for a minute. You serve 5 to 7 years, call it an apprenticeship. You already figure out how to make money, how to do stuff here in this new world. World while you're working for someone else. At the end of that 5 to 7 years, you move downstream from that individual you did work for, and you're all of a sudden this person's competitor. So from an entrepreneurial standpoint, it doesn't make sense for me to train my competitors to screw my profit margin. Not the best form of labor. So if red skin labor don't work, white skin labor is problematic. Where do we go next? You know where we go next. West Central Africa. And thus in the colonial Chesapeake, as in the colonial South, the best form of labor, especially in an agricultural society as will be largely the South, African slave labor will be the best form of labor, period. And it's important to note as we pivot to colonial New England here briefly, that slavery doesn't just exist in the colonial Chesapeake or South, it actually exists in all 13 colonies. It does. Yet the numbers of slaves in colonial New England and the middle colonies is much less. We would consider those to be societies with slaves rather than slave societies, which means if you got rid of the institution of slavery, the underpinning economy would be fine. That's the case in the North. Definitely not the case in the South. There's a cultural aspect too as it relates to slavery really not taking firm root in the North or New England society as well, and that has to do with the actual peopling of New England. Yes, they did come here to escape religious intolerance. That's entirely true. But the other part of the important part of this story is that they were middle class people. These are people that are skilled tradesmen, they are merchantmen, they are business owners. These are individuals that could pay their own way to the New World. They weren't indentured servants, and therefore they're used to paying people wages for labor. So that the culture there is one of what we would call free labor. And when I say free labor, I'm not talking about slave labor. I'm talking about the freedom of individuals to negotiate their own wages. That's free labor. And in New England, you have that, not in the South. This will largely be the same pattern in the middle colonies, that these tend to be societies with slaves as well. New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware. And while Delaware will later be considered part of the border South, it's still a society with slaves, not a slave society. So if you get rid of the institution, it's not going to cause a collapse of the underpinning economy. Therefore, it could make it easier for people to entertain the thought of emancipation. That won't largely be the case here in the South. As mentioned previously, the South is going to be fairly exclusively agrarian or agriculture in their focus. The North, much more mixed in their approach. There'll be some industry, there'll be some agriculture, so on and so forth, a little more balanced economy. But here in the South, it's largely going to be staple driven, meaning your various cereals, wheat, corn, et al. And then eventually these highly lucrative export commodities like sugar, rice, and cotton. All of them grown, all of them harvested with slave labor, meaning that the entrepreneurs have poured a lot of money, a lot of capital into owning a certain sort of property known as individuals or slaves. And if your entire economy is based on slave labor, you're going to protect it to the last because that's like protecting your own 401k. The one area of the South, and quite frankly of all British North America, that's going to be a bit of an outlier, especially early on, is colonial Georgia. And I say it was a bit of an outlier because it was established, yes, as sort of this philanthropic experiment. And for those interested, I'd ask you to Google it, to include James Oglethorpe. Interesting dude, interesting story here in colonial Georgia. But it's an outlier because it established the colony without the institution of slavery. There was no slavery here. The only place in British North America, which is kind of weird because if we think of Civil War South, you think of Georgia, Deep South, Cotton South, slave society, boom. That was not the case in the original founding. What will eventually happen over time, however, is that the colonial entrepreneurs will find that they're doing it right in South Carolina, that Charlestown, next to Philadelphia, next to New York, is one of three principal cities. They have more than 10,000 people in them. One of three principal cities in North America, and that's because of what? The wealth and power that comes with the institution of slavery. Therefore, colonial Georgia will eventually, Savannah especially, will eventually go the way that Charlestown or South Carolina did, and they'll fully embrace slave labor. Thus, in the colonial Chesapeake and the South, they are going to embrace slave labor. In those middle colonies in New England, less so, more societies with slaves, they could do with them or not do with them, and therefore the very peopling of British North America is already going to establish two generally distinct regions that are going to ultimately have to figure out which path they're going to follow. As Lincoln would say, we become all of one thing or all the other. We cannot be half slave and half free. So even before we've gotten to this American independency, we already see, in some sense, the cornerstone set for a future conflict between sections in the United States itself. For those interested in a much deeper dive into American history, I'd ask that you consider signing up for an early American course. Till then, Dr. JC out. Lecture 1415.